The West Bank has been suffering from an intensive offensive campaign by the Israeli military and settlers since the October 7th events. And they've included the militarization and the increased militarization of the settlers themselves, the cutting of cities and towns, the return of the checkpoints and cutting various towns from each other. It includes a wide arrest campaign, a mass confinement campaign that is happening with ferocity and arresting a lot of student activists, a lot of people, around 2,000 so far. It includes also an attempt by the Israeli military to use this moment to try and slow the rise of self-defense zones in areas like Tulkarem and Jenin by penetrating deep into the Jenin refugee camp or the Nur Shams refugee camp in Tulkarem. So there's all these pressures all at once coming in the West Bank. And they're indicative that it's a moment in the West Bank that is difficult, intense in terms of at least recent history, in terms of how many martyrs have been killed, almost 200 until this moment. So it's also, what is a bit different about it is that there's a lot of also daily humiliation that we don't really see on checkpoints. People being stopped, undressed. Yesterday only, Israeli army released 30 Palestinian prisoners naked in Ofer military camp. It was their moment of release, but they released them into the street naked. So there's all these forms of humiliation that are happening and layers of humiliation that are happening that also go unreported at this moment in the West Bank. So this is the general, let's say, picture. We can also talk about the political picture of how these pressures might be impacting also the PA position as it faces three pressures: the pressure of Gaza and what's happening in Gaza, and the feeling among a lot of Palestinians that it's betraying the resistance in Gaza, but also more importantly, that resistance could be successful, that it could break Israel's iron wall, that it could change political realities, etc. But also an Israeli dismissal in terms of financial sanctions that happened through the Israeli Ministry of Finance. So also the PA is being under pressure from Israel itself, from its European and American partners, and from the settler movement that we just described as pushing for more violence. So the PA is in the hot seat at this moment, trying to navigate this moment, trying to take a wait and see approach. But I think it's a very delicate and fragile moment for the current PA leadership.
Yeah, there was talk last week of the Israeli government, mulling over whether or not to have, a PA representative kind of ride in on the back of a tank and administer Gaza. What's the significance of that, fantasy, and how are Palestinians in the West Bank responding to that?
I mean, I think many in the West, Palestinian society, broadly speaking, doesn't see in the current PA leadership anything but a sort of Vichy government. And even those working within the PA itself, I don't think that anybody has illusions about the PA.
But Abud, sorry to interrupt, but why do they tolerate it? Why do they tolerate it? I mean, where is the uprising in the West Bank against these traitors? I'm just going to ask it point blank like that. We hear that the people in the West Bank very unhappy. The polls say, every piece of evidence says they understand that the PA are traitors. Why do they tolerate traitors in their midst? Why do we still hear people saying, Sayyid al-Ra'is Abu Mazen, Akhuna al-Ra'is Abu Mazen? You still hear this kind of language from some quarters. Maybe not most, but they still tolerate it. Why aren't they going and besieging the Muqata'a and getting these traitors out?
Because I think for that to happen, Ali, you need an organized social movement at least. It doesn't really happen by itself. Even if a spontaneous rebellion happens, it's always possible to confine it and limit it. One of the problems in the West Bank in the past 16 years or so, specifically after the second Intifada, was that organized opposition has become very highly problematic, highly feeble and fragile in terms of having an actual on the ground social movements. And whenever such social movements attempt to actually rise and build anything sort of an organizational structure, they're not necessarily defeated by the PA itself, but actually taken to prison by Israelis. So it's this dual control, this dual corrosion plays a big role. I'm not saying this is the only reason, but this is part of the reason why.
But
Because
Palestinians do go out and confront the Israelis, although, as we pointed out in an article a few days ago, Yoav Gallant and Herzi Halevi, the Israeli defense minister, and the Israeli military chief of staff have just in recent days praised the Palestinian Authority for crushing demonstrations against Israel in the West Bank. In other words, helping the PA in Ramallah helps Israel to reduce opposition to its genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. And yet Palestinians do go out and they do confront Israeli soldiers, and every day Palestinians are being killed by the Israeli soldiers. So there is a willingness to go out. There is a willingness to make tremendous, unbearable sacrifices among people in the West Bank. And yet the police stations of the traitor regime remain in place. The offices of the traitor regime, the Vichy regime, remain in place. I mean, I personally, I'm not in the West Bank, and I can't speak on behalf of people there, but I don't understand it. People are willing to make enormous sacrifices, and yet they allow these traitors to continue to exist and speak in their name. And I believe that without the PA, as well as other Arab regimes, but particularly the PA, Israel would not have a free hand to carry out this genocide. They are just as complicit in this genocide as almost anyone else you can point to, and people seem to be, for whatever reason, tolerating it much more than they should. People who are willing to make sacrifices. I'm not saying that they're not. They are. So I don't know. I'm putting that puzzle to you.
No, I mean it's a big puzzle. I mean, I've been thinking about it for at least a decade or so, but it is a big puzzle. I don't think there's one answer. I was just stating one of the obvious factors that you need in organizing social power to defy the PA politically. But the puzzle is,
and we know, and just sorry, Abud, we know that the PA is absolutely murderous when it comes to defending their power. Just as these thugs brutally tortured and murdered Nizar Banat, the political activist who spoke very clearly against them. They murdered him in front of his family. So I don't also want to underestimate the amount of risk people would face in challenging these thugs. But I also wanted to be clear who they are. They will murder Palestinians if their positions as Israel's collaborators depends on it.
Yeah, but I think, look, it goes beyond that. I think there is an intrinsic fear in Palestinian society of inner fighting and an attempt to avoid it. Even in the revolutionary Palestinian tradition, is that if you have an internal contradiction, you should take it out on the Israelis and not, take it out within your own group, or within the Palestinian community itself. There's that notion that plays deeply, and the PA has successfully also weaponized this notion of fitna as part of its policy of control. So remember, the PA is not just the clique that is ruling. It is also an entire bureaucracy and an entire economy that sustains many people materially. And despite the fact that these people might not like the policies of their of the elites that are controlling them, at the same time they remain silent. They remain unwilling, let's say, partners in what's happening. So there's a lot of social dynamics at play, a lot of also fear, not from the PA itself, but from Israel and its violence, the violence it shows today in Gaza, the fear that violence will come to the West Bank one way or another. There's a lot of different elements to this. I'm not trying to like make excuses. What I'm trying to say is that if you want to chart why people understand on the one hand that this is a Vichy government, and on the other hand doesn't do anything about it. And it's an interesting question for anybody who wants to analyze the situation or attempt to even change that situation or intervene in it. It's multi-layered, and I think what we've seen in the past at least 2-3 years is an unbinding from the PA from part of its social base, specifically in the north of the West Bank. The self-defense zones in the refugee camp of Jenin and Tul Karim and the old city of Nablus, no matter how successful these self-defense zones were symptomatic of an unbinding that is happening among a lot of Fatah people, among a lot of the social base that actually worked or works in the PA, moving towards a politics of confrontation and defiance and allowing for these spaces to rise. Now, what I see the problem is that the middle class in the West Bank, the middle and upper classes in the West Bank remain kind of in between, hedging in between, remain in a wait and see approach. They don't like the current leadership and where they're leading them, their lack of dignity, their lack of defiance of Israel, their inability to participate or even show any form of political solidarity with what's happening in Gaza. Even the minimum, not only that, they're complicit in what's happening in Gaza, as you outlined. And at the same time, there is an unwillingness still to confront the PA head on by unions, by academics and cultural elites. And, that is the reality. Until this moment, it still remains, there's still not much have changed in terms of breaking that ceiling in terms of people's participation and direct confrontation with the PA. And interesting enough, you mentioned Nizar. I knew Nizar for at least 8 years, 9 years, and he used to speak all the time. And what for me was interesting about Nizar's story is that only the 2 years before his murder by PA thugs, that people started to listen to what he was saying. And it showed to me that despite the fact that he was speaking for all of these years, since 2011 or 12, when I met him for the first time, that people were willing to listen only in the past 2 years, and he became a phenomenon, and he went viral in Palestinian online, which shows that things are changing in the West Bank, but they're changing slowly. And the fight in Gaza came and erupted at a moment that kind of process is still not mature enough for it to actually produce a social movement that can confront the PA, specifically in a moment that Israel decided to use that moment to take the gloves off and show its uglier face, although it always has shown an ugly face. So yeah.
And of course, it's important to point out that Palestinians do go out and protest against the PA, but it does tend to be spontaneous, and we've seen it in cities up and down the West Bank, and the PA does send out its so-called security forces, never ever to protect Palestinians against the brutal fascistic Israeli settlers, but only to protect the Israeli occupation and itself from the Palestinian people. But as you pointed out, the role of cultural elites and NGOs is an important one, because we also know that after the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993, there was a massive effort as part of the so-called international community to co-opt and buy off the political movements and turn them into salaried NGO type elites. And that has been successful. The other element, the economic element, you talked about the middle class or the bourgeoisie, as we might call them. and the upper class in the West Bank. Also, in the last 20 plus years, there's been an effort to create a kind of a neoliberal economic class, which directly benefits from the occupation in a sense. They are the people who are the import agents for various international brands, and all of that business goes through Israel. And so for them, the status quo may not be their preferred choice, but it's certainly a tolerable one, and one where they're able to continue to profit. So those are people who have, in a sense, a stake in the status quo. So those elements are not at all unique to Palestine, but I suppose what is in a way unique is that we advanced from colonization to comprador bourgeoisie and bourgeois state without ever getting the state. We skipped that step and went straight to this neoliberal hell. And I'll also point out there was a news item the other day, a nightmarish news item on top of everything else, that Israel wants to bring Tony Blair in as the so-called humanitarian coordinator for Gaza. I mean, this is like they might as well bring the ghost of Ariel Sharon in to be the humanitarian coordinator for Gaza. But Blair, as the so-called quartet representative in the early and mid 2000s, or the mid 2000s, I guess, when did he leave office? So after 2007, in the period when they brought Salam Fayyad, a former was he International Monetary Fund or World Bank? I can't remember, but one of them, a former official. They brought him in as the so-called prime minister who would prepare the Palestinians for independence and institution building and all this stuff, this very neoliberal project. But what Blair was doing as part of the so-called institution building and capacity building was pushing mortgage loans on Palestinians and debt culture. And I remember researching and writing about this, that they were pushing credit cards on Palestinians, people who, very few of which had a stable or secure income, but they were pushing consumer debt, buy a car, buy a computer, go out and buy new furniture, we'll put it all on a credit card, go out and get a mortgage for a house, you'll have to pay it for the rest of your life. But the thinking behind this, as Blair and his cohorts expressed it, was that if Palestinians are tied to these kinds of things, then they're also tied to the status quo, and they have less time to go out and challenge the status quo. And you also tell them that their salvation is not in collective action and collective liberation, but it's in individual solutions like get a mortgage, get a credit card, get a car, get a new cell phone, and so on. That was the explicit goal of Tony Blair and company under Salam Fayyad. My question for you is, how successful was that? Is that something that has taken root? Are we seeing that as a factor?
Well, I mean, my issue with a lot of these forms of analytics is that they presume that there is some sort of ideological hegemony that comes out of this, in a sense that Palestinians consent to their own unmaking, to the lack of collective action. And I think there's also a lot of violence in preventing the resurgence of an organized political movement. And this is, I think, more fundamental to me, having seen, for instance, how despite all of what you said, we still have an organized armed movement in the north of the West Bank with all of its conditions. Despite this whole individualism and atomism that we're speaking, social atomization, etc., we still have, for instance, operations that are also kind of atomistic in terms of their individuals doing operations and resistance operations, as we've seen in the past years, since at least 2015 in the West Bank, and Jerusalem. So I think in many ways, I don't think this is a completely successful. I don't think the West Bank has been pacified in a way that they imagined. But of course, it's not like Gaza, where Gaza in 2005 managed to, for a lot of reasons, partially because of the West Bank, no, because Israel at that moment decided to defeat the resistance in the West Bank, and at the same time, it couldn't tolerate its settler presence in Gaza in 2005. It withdrew from Gaza, leaving this liberated space for it to develop a resistance movement that is organized and now launching the October 7th attack. Well, while in the West Bank, we had the arrest and the pacification and the destruction of the entire organized resistance movement at that moment, which in the Second Intifada played an important and crucial role in a lot of the operations that happened and occurred. Actually, most of the operations, maybe we can say, came from the West Bank. So I do think that it's not a totally successful project. I think it's fracturing. I think it's weakening. I think that we see the signs all around of it. I still do think that an organized social movement has not risen. And whenever it's trying to rise, and I'm not here talking about armed movements, but I'm talking about social movements generally from middle class orientation that meets the working class radical politics of the Jenin refugee camp and the Nur Shams Tulkarem camp. This is still the missing component that is not going far. And I think part of the reason is not only because there's no social movement, is that the political parties that exist in the West Bank, including Hamas, including Islamic Jihad, including some others, have not really organized around such an idea, and have chosen different modes of organization, including backing up the armed resistance movement while maintaining also their middle class in a way silent and not really active or proactive in terms of political engagement. So, I mean, there's a lot of things going on in terms of analyzing why the West Bank. We can go into it more. We can speak about how also the lack of alternative to the PA worries people, creates a lot of anxiety and fear. What would happen if the PA breaks down? How would the day-to-day life within a system, this economic system, this political system that we exist under go? What would be Israel's reaction? Who would organize, civil affairs, educational affairs, health, etc.? All of these are questions that need to be organized around the social movement. And again, that social movement that could provide an alternative have not provided an alternative yet and have not risen to take up that challenge.
Well, I want to bring in our contributing editor, John Elmer, to actually, I want both of you to talk about kind of your assessment of the military situation in both Gaza and the West Bank. But John, maybe if you have any thoughts on what Abdaljawad was saying about kind of this political dynamic inside the West Bank and how that's playing into what we're seeing in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, I think not to reiterate everything Abdaljawad said, but I think that there was an organized effort by the U.S. and Israel to destroy resistance in the West Bank after the Second Intifada and after the election of Hamas. And that was a really concerted process that happened, and people saw that destruction. And I think also that there's a confusion between the regime and the services of government, which is what people are really have a hard time with, is attacking the PA that provides, schools and hospitals and basic municipal services that would be provided by a state. And then when you change the government, those resources don't get destroyed. They transfer to the new government. And that didn't happen in the West Bank. The institutions were wiped out. And I think you can't really understate that, especially after the Second Intifada, the suffering that Israel inflicted upon the West Bank, destroying people's livelihoods, their jobs. And then after that, they have a democratic election where they elect the wrong people, according to the Americans and Israelis. And the Americans and Israelis turn around and destroy those institutions. Or they prop up the Salem Fayyad parts of the institutions instead of, the the state that the Palestinians themselves like have a right to administer through an authority, whether it's the collaborator Vichy regime. They have the right to services and an effective governance that allows their general life to continue. And Israel makes it clear that that's not going to happen if you resist the security forces that are out in the streets. They're going to destroy your institutions, the jobs of your family members. And I think that can't be understated, especially in an era when Israel was building walls around all of these West Bank communities. So now they don't have as much access to resist against Israel. They're trapped inside of a ghetto and told that unless you're fighting against your own police force that's inside the ghetto, that you're not resisting. That's a very high bar to be asking of people. And I think that that's important to say, because they're trapped inside. People aren't traveling all over the West Bank. People are trapped inside their individual communities behind this 800-kilometer wall that Israel built as a response to the resistance of the Second Intifada, which also, it's worth noting, involved, especially in the early days, significantly involved the PA security forces at that time, who are very different than the PA security forces today. And Israel's very aware of that. So the entire training of the security forces is completely different than it was in the Oslo era. That's what Keith Dayton, he said he was making new men. That was what he was defining it. Dayton couldn't, this was the US military general that was put in charge of destroying Hamas after they were elected. And so I think that sometimes we confuse like government with the regime. There's lots of people that have legitimate jobs in the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank that look and see that any kind of resistance against the brutal regime that they don't like means that all of a sudden all their family is unemployed. And those are very personal attacks. And the ability to build a social movement that Abdaljawad was talking about is prevented, as he said very clearly, it's prevented by Israel. The people will be arrested by the PA, then arrested by Israel, then arrested by the PA. That's the constant underpinning of what's going on, is that Israel has conflated municipal governance, general services of the state, with this collaborator regime that nobody supports that regime. And that's why there's not elections in the West Bank since the last time Palestinians did democracy wrong.
That was by design, John, of course, because when the whole Oslo concept and the Israelis' idea behind it was, the Oslo Accords in 1993, and it goes back further than the Oslo Accords, but the concept was always the Palestinians will get at most autonomy. And autonomy means things like you can run your own schools, but of course we surveil them and make sure we approve of the textbooks. You can pick up the garbage, you can run the health clinics and that kind of thing. And so it was built into the whole concept of the so-called peace process that is all the Palestinians get. And so some Palestinians, and certainly the PA, have attached great significance to their control over these things. That, the fact that the PA runs these services is some great national achievement and some great step towards this mythical statehood that somehow never is reached. I remember a few years ago, they made a big deal about when they changed the letterhead of the Palestinian Authority from Palestinian Authority to State of Palestine. So they also get caught up in this kind of symbolism because they don't have anything else to offer people. I agree, and I appreciate that the nuance with which Abud is with which Abdaljawad answering the question, because and you, John, because it points to the dilemmas that people face at the individual level and at the collective level.
Yeah, the consequences are real, right? People saw those institutions destroyed. They saw what happened. People were arrested for who they voted for and then tortured in Israeli prison or tortured by the Palestinian Authority to say who they voted for, and then arrested by Israel because they're a supporter of Hamas. The consequences are extremely high, and that social movement, to build a social movement under occupation, it's a serious challenge. And every time Palestinians have done it, those institutions have been liquidated. And it's not even totally clear, just even in a theoretical discussion, what you say when you say what comes after the PA, because for a lot of people, the PA means those things that you said, Ali, like trash collection or whatnot. Between those kind of things that are run by UNRWA and they're run by the PA, those are things that Palestinians have a right to, that are destroyed as soon as that resistance happens. And those arrests, and the increase of arrests, I mean, those stories that Abdaljawad said about the arrests, like Israel is going at those arrests, and torturing people in prison and letting them, because they know that there's a prisoner exchange coming. And so they're actually having it out on the prisoners, making TikTok videos. But these are people's friends and family. Everybody knows the consequences of these kind of actions. So spontaneous action is attacked immediately, as Abdaljawad said, in multiple spheres, because you have the Israelis acting in multiple ways through the Palestinian government, and you have the Palestinian regime themselves who are trying to, protect their own status. So it's like a multi-layered war that happens on people constantly, and the consequence of it is apparently that you'll lose those basic institutions, which is what happened in the Intifada when Israel attacked, when the Palestinian security forces joined the Intifada. Israel destroyed all of the institutions of their security forces. Those are very high consequences that make it complicated for people to operate in these kind of idealistic ways.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on Donate Now. Thank you.